I want to think about politics in its sort of rawest form, so not in the same way that you've just been discussing, which is the sort of influencing policy makers in quite a technical way, using sort of data and analysis and argument, but politics at the level of sort of elite politicians, especially as they develop strategy, narrative, big argument, the sort of thing that you hear in a party political broadcast or a general election campaign. And what is the sort of interface between academia and that kind of politics? That's the question that I'm interested in talking about. And I'm interested in it for lots of reasons, but one is, as was just said, is that I've just come out of that experience, working with the Labour Party for the last 3.5 years, co-writing the manifesto, writing all of Ed's big speeches since 2012. And it's been an absolutely fascinating experience, slightly overwhelming. I'm slightly exhausted, but nonetheless I survived and I came out the other end. And it did make me think in lots of ways that I probably hadn't previously about this interaction between academia and politics. So that's what I want to touch on. And I want to start with a story which sort of predates my interaction with Ed as leader of the opposition, which goes back to around about 2005, 2006. Now, at that time, I was the politics fellow at University College in Oxford. I'd been a lecturer in politics for many years, starting in Bristol and teaching at Cambridge, then teaching at Oxford. And I was doing a fairly mainstream sort of academic track, mainly in political theory, with some work in British politics and American politics alongside. And Ed was, as some of you might know, a personal friend. We'd gone to college together, but we hadn't seen much of each other since he went into proper politics and I went into academia. So we sort of diverged in our life choices and lifestyles accordingly. But in 2005 he was elected to Parliament, and he was sort of reaching out to various old friends to try and see whether there was anything that could help him have a political career, a successful parliamentary career, if you like. So I got this nice email from his staff saying, "Haven't seen you for ages, Mark. Can you come to Westminster to have a chat? Let's have dinner and let's catch up." And I thought, well, that'd be nice. So I went off to Portcullis House in Westminster, which is the sort of cafeteria area, for those of you who haven't been. First time I'd ever been there, and I bumped into Ed. He met me at reception, and we went in and we had dinner, and it was all very pleasant. And then about 3/4 of the way through the dinner, he caught me unawares with this question. He looked at me right in the eye, and he said, "Mark, what's the big idea?" And I said, "I've got no idea what you're talking about." And he said, "I need a big idea. I'm never going to get anywhere unless I've got a big idea. What is it?" And I said, "Well, I've got no clue what the big idea is. I've got lots of little ideas, but I haven't got a big one." And he looked very crestfallen and sort of disappointed. So the dinner ended. Off he went, and off I went back to college, back to university. And I spent the next 3 or 4 weeks sort of slagging him off to all of my colleagues. Because I said, I've met an old friend of mine, he's now a politician. He asked me this ridiculous question, which is, what is the big idea? And I said, how absurd to think that that's how academia works, that what we do is we sit around and we come up with kind of grand schemes, and they're ready to give to a politician. And people catch me on this now, because I must have talked to almost everyone in Oxford saying how ridiculous this thing was, and how small-minded politicians were, and how cheap they were, and how they didn't have any integrity, and how they didn't understand data, and how they didn't understand research, and it didn't work like that. So I was kind of irate about this, thinking that politicians, all the cliches that you think about politicians, I thought at that moment, and it was sort of seemed to be clarified by that interaction. I didn't think about it again since. I carried on with my academic career. And then when Ed was elected leader of the party, 2010, I kind of got back in touch because I just wanted to help. And I wanted to sort of see what I could do. And, his friends, he was going through a hard time, a big job. I wanted to see if there was anything that I could offer. And so we were having coffee at his house once, and I reminded him of this conversation. And he had a couple of staff with him at the time. So I said, I'm willing to come and do what I can to help, but I've got to say, the big idea question kind of freaked me out, and I haven't got any. And he looked at me, and his staff, I remember, looked at me in real kind of disappointment. And one of his staff said something to me which really struck home. He said, "Well, that's what we think scholarship is about. We think there are big walls between the academy and the real world, and on the other side of the wall, there are clever people like you doing big thinking, which somehow doesn't emanate out and reach us. And so we feel, as politicians," they said, stuck looking for exciting new ideas, new policy directions, new programs, new narratives, and unable to access all this secret, wonderful stuff that must be going on in academia because you're all so clever and you've got all this time to do all this thinking. I remember I said to him, but that's exactly the opposite of the way that we think about it. Well, at least most of the colleagues that I know. We thought of it as kind of the opposite of big ideas. We thought of big ideas as being simplifications, like, crude top lines, headlines. And we thought what we do is sort of has integrity and nuance and caveat and detail, and it's a sort of footnote on a footnote on a footnote. Or more politely, we kind of stand on the shoulders of giants and we think about the things that they might have missed as a result of their gigantic stature. And so what we write are thoughtful, detailed, careful pieces which make arguments, but which nonetheless don't have the grandiosity which the politicians expected us to have. And in that exchange, I began to think, okay, actually, it isn't the case that there's like one group of people who are good, i.e. scholars, and one group of people who are kind of bad and crude, i.e. politicians. Rather, there's just a complete misunderstanding of the vulnerabilities of both. So the politicians are desperate because they're locked in a very competitive, very difficult world. They're desperate for new thinking, genuine new thinking, because they want to approach problems in new ways, fresh ways. They want to have exciting things to say to the media and to their constituents, and they don't have the time or the space to develop that thinking. They're locked in the day-to-day 24-hour media news cycle. So they're feeling vulnerable because they don't think they have any access to thought, if you like. Whereas we as scholars, I think, feel vulnerable because the worst thing that you can ask a scholar to do is to be crude, or to simplify. The hardest criticism in political philosophy is that you've missed a nuance. You've misread a footnote or you've misread a crucial line in John Rawls's theory of justice, and as a result, everything that follows is wrong. So you're stuck in this world which is caveated and careful, and we associate integrity with the smallness of the claim or the detail of the claim. And so, in fact, what was going on, I think, is this sort of mismatch of understandings about what each is looking for or what each can deliver. And as time went on, as I kind of said, okay, well, I'll stick with this and see how this conversation went, it struck me, two things really struck me, which were I was missing. That wasn't Ed's fault for asking what I thought was the crude question, but I was missing as an academic about what we need to do in order to be able to translate our research or our ideas into a form which is accessible and useful to politicians. Again, not policymakers or civil servants, but elite politicians thinking about sort of electoral winning strategies. So I noticed there was two things I was missing. So the first thing, and some of you will just think I'm not very bright, and you would have got there much quicker, but it took me a long time to get there. The first thing is that our ideas are bigger than we generally think they are, because we are immersed in scholarly literatures which are themselves sort of have at their heart big claims or sort of grander claims about the ways that we look at the world. And we tend to take those for granted because we're so immersed in the literature, and what we're trying to do is respond to the literature or be in the literature, that what we don't do is kind of zoom the lens back, to use a simple metaphor, and think, all right, what is the unifying thought in this body of literature to which the politician has no access at all? The politician hasn't read any of this since university, and so is completely devoid. They don't want the detail, but they do want access to a new way, a different way of looking at big problems, looking at the world. And if you think, and I began to think, well, if I stitch together, not my own research, but the literatures within which I'm engaged, and think, how can I actually say, all right, I'll take the 50 best articles, the things which have really influenced my thinking, and I'll pull them together, and I'll start to synthesize them in my head, and I'll say my job with regard to the politician, in this case Ed, is to say, look, this is what I think is the fundamental claim underpinning this literature, and if you think about problems in that way, you start to see them differently. And so you are, in some sense, you're a popularizer of complex academic literatures when you're in that conversation. But I think it's a little bit more profound than that. I think you're not just a popularizer. What you're trying to do is distill the central fundamental claim of the literatures that motivate and excite you. Tease that theme out and give it to someone who's desperate for intellectual sustenance, but who's been locked away from scholarship for a very long time. So you're saying, look, if you start to look at the problems of whatever you're interested in this way, you begin to see those problems differently. And you equip the politician, therefore, with what you might grandly call a worldview, but more sort of less grandly, is a set of different ways of analysing existing problems. And the only way you can do that is if you can step back from your research, step back from the weeds of the arguments, and as I say, bring together all of the core academic literature that motivates you and distill it into its central fundamental claims so that it can then be represented to someone who has no access to that material. And I must say, I find my colleagues and I, struggle with that because we're so immersed in the literatures that stepping back and sort of drawing it together and repositioning is very, very, very difficult task. But if you do it well, you can have a real impact. And you get politicians who then say, yeah, okay, I've got it now. And I'll give you an example in a second of how that works. But that is the first kind of task, I think. So realising that you do have grand things to say, but they're not yours, they're not the result of your research, they're the result of a whole body of literature upon which you're dependent, to which the politician has no access, and your role is to synthesise and represent. That's my first sort of argument, I guess. The second argument is that if that's the first task, the second task is to be a patient advisor and guide through the process of utilising that first piece of information. So too many of us, I think, and again, it's a self-criticism as much as anything, but too many of our academics, what we like to do is we stay in the academy or in the library or in the seminar room and we move out for a quick dose of impact and then we move back in again. And we carry on, and we carry on, and we carry on. And I've written so many HRC proposals which look like that. It's like the impact plan, which gets longer and longer. But it's like, if you think about the work plan of a piece of research, there's a distinctive bit, which is the impact bit, which is hopefully a little bit more than dissemination. Maybe a sort of participatory exchange or something, or perhaps it's a bit at the beginning and a bit at the end. But it's still, in most of our minds, a distinct exercise. And most of our vocational life we spend doing research, library-based work, interviews, writing, the stuff of academic life. My own thought on this then is that you can't hope to impact a politician like that, because the job of real political impact has to be constant. Because if you think what I was trying to say in the first piece, what you're trying to do is open their mind to see problems in a new way. But in order to help that happen, you've got to be at their side, at their writing elbow, or on the end of the phone, or at least on the end of an email, constantly. Because as you might imagine, if you were taking a new student on, they need sort of guidance, not for you to tell them what to think, but for them to keep coming back to you saying, I'm trying to look at this problem in the way that you advised. Am I doing it? If I ask these questions of this problem, am I getting to what you think that the literature suggests that I should do? And they can't, there's absolutely no way they can do that on their own. Not because they're incapable of doing it, but because they have got millions of other jobs to do. So the way that I always thought about it when I was working with Ed is, look, he's got economic advisors, he's got press advisors, he's got parliamentary advisors, he's got constituency advisors. There's a role for an academic advisor, who is someone who's there not to, constantly do tutorials. Although it was a bit too much of that, but to say, look, you remember what we decided 6 months ago? We decided we were going to look at problems in this way, and here's an example of a problem. It's just come up. Talk me through how you're looking at it. In much the same way as a coach would in the sporting world or in the business world. Someone who can reflect on what the problem is, how the politician is looking at it, and be there as a probe and a prod for them to look at the problem in a different kind of way. So my big argument today is, don't think about, if you want to impact detail, that's a different job. But if you're interested in impacting elite politics, you're interested in actually being of use to people who are devising programmatic positions for political parties, and it doesn't have to be in Westminster, it could be in Edinburgh or in Cardiff or in local government, but you're interested in being there for politicians, what they are after is new ways of looking at problems that they can't work out without the guidance of someone like you. And I think the two tasks that you can do, as I say, are synthesize whole literatures, not just individual pieces of research, and then be there constantly as someone to help them think about that process, so that it's an ongoing reflection about the world in which they go. So let me kind of close, let me kind of draw it close by just with an example of how this works well and badly over my time with Ed. I mean, some of you will think it was all bad, and there are a few nutters out there who think it was all good, but I think that there were ups and there were downs. But let me just touch on what I think is the sort of the most powerful moment, which was that we wrote a speech together in autumn 2012, which was called One Nation speech, and it was for the Labour Party conference. And some of you will remember Ed's leadership was in a real bad state at this point. His previous conference speech, the year before in 2011, had got very bad press. Partly for the content. It was called the Predators and Producers speech. Some of you might remember it. But largely for the fact that it was thought to have no real vision. It was not entertaining. It didn't grab the commentators. And I was at Labour Party conference in 2011, and I remember all the journalists stood in a circle outside the conference hall after the speech. And they were all agreeing with each other that it was a dreadful speech, and if next year's speech was as dreadful as that one, it was kind of all over Red Rover for Ed's leadership. Now, that may have been overstated, and it wasn't that bad a speech, actually, but nonetheless, that was the view that the journalistic community had met. And so Ed came to me in like the summer of 2012 and said, look, what we need is a speech for me, for conference, which is going to be received as more visionary, more interesting, more exciting, more personal, more potentially transformatory. Yeah, so it has to be bigger, and it has to say something which people will find interesting from different sides of the political spectrum. So I thought, well, no small job. So I said, what do you want to say? And he said to me, we had long conversations over the summer, he said that he wanted to get to grips with a paradox in his head. He said, on the one hand, he was a radical who wanted to do big change in Britain, big economic change, especially closing the gap between the very rich and the very poor. Inequality was his issue, and he knew that was a radical economic position. He knew it was relatively unpopular, but that he cared about it. And he said, on the other hand, he knew that he was, by kind of nature, a sort of small c conservative, which is that he cares very much for community, traditional ways of life, family life. He's a very gentle soul, he's a very decent soul, very polite soul. And he said the paradox is trying to get those two things across at the same time. And he said, that's what I want to do, because that's the offer I want to make to the British public. I'm a radical, but I'm not like a kind of loony revolutionary who's going to throw bricks through windows. I'm going to achieve radical ends in a gentle, kindly way. So that was the mission he gave me. And then I thought, okay, what the hell can I do as an academic which is going to help? And I thought, actually, it's really easy, because what he was actually asking me to do, any of you are political philosophers, he was asking me to combine sort of communitarian political theory, which is a theory about sort of community, about locality, about decency, about generosity of spirit, about solidarity, which is the sort of kindly side. He was asking me to do that with a sort of egalitarian political philosophy, which was a sort of bolder political philosophy about what should the gap between the rich and poor be, what's just. Those people who know John Rawls's theory of justice, that kind of argument, an argument about the merits, the intellectual merits of equality, the economic merits of equality. So he was actually, although he didn't know it, asking me to synthesize two literatures in political philosophy. And that's what I did. So I went back and I read the literature and I thought about, this is the task I've been charged. These are the two literatures he's really touching at. I think if you bring them together in this way, we're going to have something interesting to say. And so I wrote a speech called One Nation. We worked on it all the summer, and I'm incredibly proud of that piece of work. I'm not saying it's great, for you, but for me, I loved it, because I thought I'd done the job, which is I've had 20 years of researching and teaching political philosophy. I've been asked by a politician to help him deliver a story, a message, which actually draws on those two literatures, although he was unaware of that fact. I went back to the literature, I synthesized it, I drew it together, and I gave it to him, and he made it his own. And it had amazing impact. It was a fantastic day, it was amazingly well received in the hall, and it was a fabulous point of discussion in the press for a very long time. It dominated the news agenda for a good 2 months. And there was a moment at which we had achieved what we set out to achieve, which is tried to give people something, a different way of looking at the world, which combined the values of community and equality, or a sort of decency and radical change. And that was the task. Now, just to close, I say I don't think a non-academic could have done that job. Yeah, I'm not to say they couldn't have written a better speech. There are professional speechwriters out there who are wonderful, but they couldn't have done the job that I did because I was immersed in the literature. But on the other hand, I couldn't have done that job had I not been shocked 10 years previous almost by Ed asking me these difficult questions about are there any big ideas in scholarship. It was only by leaving the literature, at least momentarily, that I was able to do the task of actually drawing it from its strengths, if that makes any sense. So for me, that's the paradox. You've got to be in it to know it, but you've got to be able to get out of it and to draw it together in order to reposition it. It's a huge thrill when it goes well, and to me, it's also a moral duty. I mean, there's no purpose in having the mastery of the material if we can't give it to someone. It doesn't always have to be a politician, but in my job, that was the particular task. I'll end that there, and we can have a discussion. Thank you.
Actually, in politicians and politics in general, it's much quicker.
Yeah.
And normally we need to have the time to reflect and do our research. So how you manage this transition from a different pace, from politics to academia to politics?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. I mean, two answers. I think the time thing is sometimes less of a challenge than it seems, because in politics there are two speeds. There's sort of day-to-day media response or political response work, but there is also a strategic speed, which is, in the UK, it's a 5-year election cycle. So, when it goes well, you're using all of that 5 years to develop the argument that you'll eventually use in the 6 weeks of the general election period. So there is a slow track going on at the same time as there's all the fast stuff. And good politicians will have their strategists and their thinkers working at that longer time horizon. That is relatively slow. So when I was working, I wasn't always working in the breakneck speed of mainstream politics. Sometimes I was working in this slower, like we've got a speech in 3 months' time, that's a staging post to another one in 12 months' time, that's a staging post to the election. And so that time horizon is more similar to writing a DPhil or a book. So I think that's, it's important to recognise that. But the other thing I'd say is that, it does come frustrating when you go back to academia that people can't work with a deadline. It's like in politics, the deadlines aren't, you don't invent them, they're real. And if there was a debate in the House this week, as everyone knows, on the Syria crisis, if you haven't got a speech ready for the debate, you haven't got a speech ready. So sometimes you have to be able to work to speed. But the trick there is to have as much of the material ready in your head in the strategic speed so that you can translate it more effectively. And to tell the truth, I didn't find it particularly challenging to move between those two things. But you just have to be ready to do it and put the time in to work to the deadline.
It seems that in your case, your political ideals ended up matching up with those of the person who you were working for. Do you think there's a space for working in an advisory capacity for people who don't share your political values? And what would be the challenges of this sort of dialogue across paradigms?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question, and I don't know the answer fully. With Ed, we agreed on sort of 60% of things, and we disagreed on 40. And for me, the challenge was always to try and deal with that, because my job was to give him words and not to use my words. There, I think it is closer to being a sort of, like an undergraduate lecturer or a tutor in a sense, which is like someone needs to know something, and your job is to work out the best way that they can start to think about that problem, rather than judge whether it's the right problem to be thinking about. And so, the 40% of the time, he would want to say things that I didn't agree with, or weren't core to my value set. But my job, again, was to try and equip him with a interesting way, or a new way, or a quirky way of looking at the problem. And so you could do that academically. I think if the balance were more than 60-40, if it was tipped the other direction, it eventually would become so hard that you couldn't do it. or just motivation would be very, very difficult to find. But I do think it's a sliding scale, so I think that I don't think you have to find the candidate who is 100% you. I think you can get you probably close to 50-50 and you can still be of use.
I work in design and manufacturing and innovation,
Right.
and I'm kind of struggling with like evidence-based policy and what that is, and kind of what your take is as an academic, because I find that there's myriad different bodies of evidence that land in different ways, kind of what's your sort of instinctive reaction to that?
I mean, from what that's it's a really difficult question, but an important one. From what I saw, the way that politics approaches these questions is from argument first and evidence second, which doesn't mean that you do play fast and loose with the evidence, but it means you come to the evidence after you've got a general argument that you want to make. So very rarely did I see any politician be confronted by a bit of data or a bit of evidence, which then they thought, oh, well, if that's true, we're going to do something totally different. I mean, it's just not that kind of game. It is a competition between ideologically motivated groups of people who believe fundamentals. Now, that I think can sometimes strike scholars as they say, oh, I don't like that. That's like bias and non-objective and not evidence-based. The problem is that is politics. It ain't going to change. And it's also, generally speaking, a good thing that people who believe things, and who are motivated by core moral principle, go in to try to govern. So the force, I think, from a think tank perspective lies, all right, what kind of influence do you want to have? Do you want to have influence at the level of ideology, argument, and strategy, which is where I was? Or do you want to have, sort of influence at the level of sort of detailed policy prescription, implementation, administration, technical excellence? For whatever it's worth, in my judgment, the evidence material works really well in that second box. So if you're not interested in shaping the big picture strategy, ideology, if you really have something which you care about technically, then being evidence-driven in various different ways is definitely the way to do it. But one shouldn't imagine you're going to have an impact on the strategic story or the ideological story in that way. And I think most think tanks, I'm going off to run one, I'm going to New Economics Foundation to run one, so I'm pro-think tanks. But most think tanks think the only game in town is the evidence policy technical game. And that's missing at least half of politics, is what I'd say. So I think you need to be, if you are going to be in that zone, good luck to you. It's great and important work, but you can't imagine that it's the whole of the political process. The political process is also driven by narrative, ideology, strategy, and that's a different kind of engagement.
Do you think there's any scope for? I'm not going to say there's scope for sort of more junior academics to do it, because I think it's not really the question. It's more, do you think there's scope for more of a systematic teamwork approach in academia to address that side of politics?
Absolutely certain there is. I mean, my own view is that at all levels of the political process, one of the things that politicians of all kinds need is argument, strategy, ideology. And some of them just get that from their gut. Some of them inherit it from somebody else. But a large number of them are looking for people to help them reflect, to present to them interesting and important arguments from scholarship. And there's absolutely no reason why you can't do that, be present at every level of your scholarly career. It is a question, coming back to the earlier question, it's about a question about finding the people that you want to work with, that you have a good rapport with, who are interested in the kinds of things you've got to say. But it's also just about doing the two things that I've tried to describe, being able to step back from your own research and synthesize literatures, and then having the patience to stick with someone and to see that process through. But you could definitely do it, and I see this locally all the time. I mean, I live in Hackney, and we have some great local councillors, and they are desperate for people to do that with them, to help them look at the really complicated problems in local government. In Hackney at the moment, we've got this huge row about whether you should build expensive private housing in order to fund the education budget, given the cuts. And what does it mean for the integration of communities, for gentrification, but also what does it mean for the provision of good quality primary schools for those people who don't have them? That to me it's an academic question, it's a philosophical question. Most councillors don't have the time or the energy or the expertise to be able to really think those problems through, and there's space there for scholars, So someone who is local but who has, thought about these literatures, can easily represent them, work with people and develop. It doesn't have to be, someone looking to be in number 10. It can be that level too. All right, thank you so much, everybody. Lovely to be here. Good luck with the rest of the day, and good luck with the future.